Ibrahim held the photograph with trembling hands, memories flooding back with unexpected force. He remembered Aminata helping him with his homework, her patient voice explaining mathematical concepts in ways that made sense to his child's mind. He remembered her leaving for university in Ouagadougou, the entire village of Bondoukoui celebrating her achievement. He remembered his mother's pride, his father's quiet satisfaction that his daughter would become a doctor, and he remembered the day she stopped coming home, the confusion when her letters ceased, the growing panic as weeks turned to months with no word, the police investigation that seemed to go nowhere, the official conclusion that she had simply abandoned her studies and left the country, his mother's tears, his father's anger, and his own childhood inability to understand why everyone seemed to accept that Aminata was just gone. Now, 29 years later, Ibrahim turned the photograph over and found writing on the back. The ink was faded but still legible. First day of second year, October 1995. Ready to change the world, A. Typed below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, Thomas Sankara Memorial, last rally. Ibrahim's heart began to race. Thomas Sankara had been assassinated in 1987, 8 years before this photo was supposedly taken. Why would someone reference his memorial at a rally in 1995? He carefully set the photograph aside and continued searching through the box with renewed purpose. Beneath more family photos, he found a small notebook, its pages yellowed with age. Opening it, he recognized Aminata's handwriting immediately, the same neat script that had filled the letters she'd sent home during her first year at university. But these entries were different. They weren't letters, they were journal entries, and they told a story he had never heard. September 12, 1995. Attended my first student organization meeting today. The National Association of Students of Burkina Faso is organizing protests about university funding cuts. Professor Diallo says we have a responsibility to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. I think of Sankara and wonder what he would do. Ibrahim read entry after entry, watching his sister's political awakening unfold across the pages. She had joined student movements, participated in protests, become increasingly vocal about corruption and the government's failures. The entries grew more passionate, more urgent, documenting a young woman discovering her voice and her power to demand change. The final entry was dated November 3, 1995. Tomorrow we're holding a major demonstration at the Ministry of Education. They're threatening to expel leaders of the movement, but we won't be silenced. If something happens to me, I want everyone to know I believed in something worth fighting for. Burkina Faso deserves better. Our people deserve better. After that, blank pages. Aminata had written no more. Ibrahim sat in stunned silence, the implications crashing over him like waves. His sister hadn't abandoned her studies. She hadn't left the country. She had been silenced, and his family had been told lies. Chapter 2. Questions without answers. That evening, Ibrahim called his mother from his secure line. She answered with the careful happiness she always displayed when speaking to her son, the president, pride mixed with the perpetual worry of a mother whose child held dangerous responsibility. Mother, I found some boxes you sent. There's a photograph of Aminata I've never seen before. The silence on the other end was long and heavy. When his mother finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of suppressed grief. I saved everything of hers. Your father wanted to throw it all away, said it hurt too much to remember, but I couldn't let her disappear completely. Mother, did you know she was involved in student protests? Political activism. Another pause. We heard rumors. Other families would mention seeing her at demonstrations, but when she disappeared, the police said we should stop asking questions. They said it would only make things worse for our family. Your father was still in the military then. They threatened his career if we continued searching. Ibrahim closed his eyes, understanding now why his parents had accepted the official explanation even when it made no sense. They had been forced into silence, threatened with consequences if they pursued the truth. Did anyone ever tell you what really happened to her? No. His mother's voice broke. For 29 years I've wondered, did she run away? Was she arrested? Did she die? Not knowing is a torture that never ends. Every day, I imagine a different possibility, and none of them bring peace. After ending the call, Ibrahim sat in his office as night fell over Ouagadougou. He was the president of Burkina Faso, commander of its armed forces, a man with access to intelligence networks and classified archives. If anyone could uncover the truth about what happened to Aminata Traoré in 1995, it was him. But did he want to know? Would the truth bring the closure his mother desperately needed, or would it open wounds that could never heal? He looked again at the photograph of his sister, young and hopeful, standing in front of the university with her whole life ahead of her. She deserved better than to be forgotten, better than to exist only as an unanswered question, and his family deserved to know what had happened to her. Ibrahim picked up his phone and called Major Zongo, his most trusted intelligence officer. "I need you to research something sensitive, very sensitive. I want every document and every report, every piece of evidence related to student protests at the University of Ouagadougou in November 1995, and I want information on anyone who went missing during that period. How far back into the archives should I go, Captain?" "All the way. Whatever classification, whatever restrictions, I authorize full access. This is personal, Major, but it's also about truth. Our nation has too many unhealed wounds, too many stories we've been afraid to confront. It's time we stopped running from our own history." Chapter 3. The Archives. 3 days later, Major Zongo arrived at Ibrahim's office carrying 3 sealed boxes and a thick folder marked with multiple classification stamps. His expression was troubled as he set them on the desk. "Captain, what I found is disturbing. The records from 1995 were supposed to be destroyed, but someone in the intelligence service preserved copies. I don't know if they were planning to use them for something, or if they simply couldn't bring themselves to eliminate historical evidence. Either way, you should prepare yourself." Ibrahim opened the first box and began sorting through documents. Police reports, surveillance photographs, intelligence assessments, all from the period when his sister had been at university. As he read, a dark picture emerged of systematic repression of student activism. The government of Blaise Compaoré, the man who had assassinated Thomas Sankara and ruled Burkina Faso for 27 years, had viewed student movements as threats to stability. Any organization that invoked Sankara's name, that called for reforms or challenged corruption, was monitored, infiltrated, and when necessary, neutralized. Major Zongo opened the second box and pulled out a surveillance photograph. It showed a crowd of students marching through downtown Ouagadougou, carrying banners demanding educational funding and political reform. In the crowd, clearly visible, was Aminata Traoré, her fist raised, her face animated with passion. The demonstration happened on November 4th, 1995, Zongo explained quietly. It started peacefully, but security forces intervened. According to the official report, several students were arrested for inciting violence and disturbing public order. 23 names are listed in the arrest records. He handed Ibrahim a typed list. Halfway down, he found what he was both searching for and dreading. Aminata Traoré, age 20, medical student, National Association of Students of Burkina Faso, arrested for seditious activities. Ibrahim's hands shook as he held the document. His sister had been arrested. She hadn't abandoned her family. She hadn't disappeared voluntarily. She had been taken by the state, and someone had made sure his family never knew. "Oh, where was she held?" Ibrahim asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Major Zongo pulled out another document. According to prison records, she and 12 other students were transferred to a detention facility outside Ouagadougou. But here's where the trail goes cold. There's no release date, no transfer to another facility, no court records. After they entered that facility, there's simply no more documentation. They disappeared. Yes, Captain. 13 students were arrested that day in November 1995. 13 students entered detention, and 13 students were never heard from again. Ibrahim stood and walked to the window, struggling to process what he was learning. His sister had been one of 13 people who had simply vanished into Burkina Faso's security apparatus, erased from official record as if they had never existed. And for 29 years, families had grieved without answers, forced to imagine endless possibilities because the truth had been deliberately hidden. "I want to know who gave the orders," Ibrahim said. "Who authorized the arrests? Who commanded the detention facility? Who made the decision that these students should disappear? I want names." Major Zongo hesitated. "Captain, some of those names, they're people who are still alive, still influential. This investigation could have political ramifications. I don't care about political ramifications, Ibrahim said firmly. 13 families have been denied the truth for nearly 3 decades. My mother has spent 29 years wondering if her daughter is alive or dead. That ends now. Find me the names. Chapter 4. The Facility. Ibrahim spent the next week reviewing every document in the boxes, reading his sister's story in fragmented pieces scattered across official reports and surveillance photographs. He saw her at rallies, at study sessions where students discussed philosophy and politics, at protests where she stood in the front lines demanding justice. She had been brilliant, passionate, and brave. Everything his childhood memories had remembered and more. The detention facility where she had been held was still standing, though it had been abandoned for years. Located 30 kilometers outside Ouagadougou, it was a low concrete structure surrounded by high walls, slowly being reclaimed by the savanna vegetation. Ibrahim decided he needed to see it himself, to walk where his sister had walked in her final documented days. He arrived at dawn, accompanied only by Colonel Diallo and 2 trusted soldiers. The gate hung open, rusted hinges no longer able to hold it closed. Inside, the facility was exactly what he expected from a place designed to hold political prisoners. Small cells, minimal facilities, an atmosphere of deliberate dehumanization. They walked through the cell blocks, Ibrahim's boots echoing on concrete floors. In one cell, someone had scratched words into the wall. They can imprison our bodies, but not our dreams. In another, a list of names, prisoners marking their presence, refusing to be forgotten. Captain, over here, Colonel Diallo called from the end of the corridor. Ibrahim joined him in what appeared to have been an administrative office, now stripped of furniture, but still containing filing cabinets bolted to the walls. Diallo had forced one open and was sorting through mildewed papers. These are intake records from 1995, Diallo explained. They document who was brought here and when. Ibrahim took the papers carefully, knowing they might be fragile. The record for November 5, 1995, listed 13 names, including Aminata's. Each entry included a photograph, and seeing his sister's face in an official detention record, young, defiant, afraid, nearly broke his composure. But it was what came next that changed everything. Behind the intake records, hidden in the back of the drawer, was a different kind of document. Not official, not typed, but handwritten. A letter dated November 28, 1995, and addressed to no one specific. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, written by someone who knew they might not have another opportunity to tell their story. Ibrahim began to read aloud. My name is Aminata Traoré. I am a medical student at the University of Ouagadougou. I was arrested on November 4th during a peaceful demonstration and brought to this facility with 12 other students. We have been held here for 24 days without charges, without trial, without our families being informed. We are given minimal food and water. We are interrogated daily, pressured to provide names of other student activists, threatened with violence if we don't cooperate. 3 days ago, security officials told us we would be transferred to another location. We don't know where, we don't know why, but the guards' expressions suggest we should be afraid. I am writing this because I fear I may not get another chance to tell the truth about what happened to us. We were arrested for demanding better education, for protesting corruption, for believing that Burkina Faso could be better than this. We committed no violence. We harmed no one. We simply wanted our voices to be heard. If anyone finds this letter, please tell my family I loved them. Please tell them I didn't abandon them. Please tell them I believed in something worth fighting for. And please, tell the truth about what happened to 13 students who dared to hope for a better future. Aminata Traoré, November 28, 1995. Ibrahim finished reading, tears streaming down his face. 29 years later, his sister's final message had reached him. She hadn't disappeared. She hadn't run away. She had been taken, held, and then, "What?" "Captain," Colonel Diallo said gently. "There's more." He handed Ibrahim another document from the file, a brief, bureaucratic memo dated December 1, 1995, stamped confidential, and signed by someone whose name Ibrahim recognized, General Gilbert Diendéré, who would later become one of Blaise Compaoré's most powerful security officials. The memo was chillingly simple. 13 political prisoners transferred from detention facility to permanent resolution, December 1, 1995. Authorization, President's Office. Status, complete. Permanent resolution, Ibrahim repeated. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what it meant. His sister and 12 other students had been executed, murdered by their own government for the crime of demanding justice. Chapter 5. The Weight of Truth. Ibrahim remained at the abandoned facility for hours after Colonel Diallo and the soldiers left, sitting in the cell where his sister had likely been held, holding her letter, trying to comprehend the enormity of what had been done. 13 young people, full of potential and hope, had been killed for believing in Burkina Faso's future. And for nearly 3 decades, their families had been denied even the dignity of knowing what happened. His phone rang repeatedly, government business that couldn't wait. But he ignored it. For this moment, he wasn't the president. He was simply Ibrahim, a little brother who had lost his sister and was finally learning why. When he eventually returned to Ouagadougou, it was late evening. Instead of going to his office or the presidential residence, he drove to his mother's house in the city's older quarter, where she had moved after his father's death. She met him at the door, immediately sensing something was wrong. "Ibrahim, what is it?" He sat with her in the small living room where he had spent countless childhood evenings, and he told her everything. About the photograph that had started his investigation, about the journal entries revealing Aminata's activism, about the documents proving she had been arrested, and finally, about the letter she had written in her final days and the memo that documented her execution. His mother wept silently, her hands covering her face, shoulders shaking with 29 years of suppressed grief, finally finding release. When she could speak, her voice was barely audible. "All this time I hoped she was alive somewhere, that maybe she had reasons for not contacting us, that someday she might come home. Now that hope is gone, but at least I know she didn't abandon us, that she was brave until the end." "Mother, I'm going to make this public," Ibrahim said. "Not just Aminata's story, but all of it. The 13 students who were murdered, the systematic repression of activists, all the truth we've been afraid to confront. Burkina Faso can't build a better future if we keep running from our past." His mother looked at him with red, tired eyes. "Will it be dangerous? For you, for our family?" "Possibly. Some of the people involved in these crimes are still alive, still influential. But that's exactly why the truth needs to come out. We can't have justice if we protect the guilty." She reached out and took his hand, the same way she had when he was a child, afraid of the dark. "Your sister would be proud of you. She fought for truth when it cost her everything. Now you're doing the same. That's what leadership means. Not protecting yourself, but standing for what's right even when it's hard." Chapter 6. The Public Truth. 3 weeks later, Ibrahim stood before the nation in a televised address. Behind him was a large photograph, the one he had found in the box, showing Aminata in her yellow dress full of life and hope. Next to it were photographs of the other 12 students who had been arrested with her, young faces that had never had the chance to grow old. "My fellow Burkinabés," he began, "tonight I must tell you a story that our nation has been hiding for 29 years. It is a story about 13 young people who believed that speaking truth to power was worth the risk. It is a story about systematic repression, about a government that murdered its own citizens for demanding justice. And it is my personal story, because one of those 13 students was my sister, Aminata Traoré." He detailed everything he had discovered, the protests, the arrests, the detention, and the final memo authorizing permanent resolution of political prisoners who had committed no crime beyond believing in a better Burkina Faso. For nearly 3 decades, 13 families have grieved without closure, wondering what happened to their loved ones. Tonight, I can give them the truth, though it brings no comfort. Their children, their siblings, their friends were murdered by the state they were trying to improve. They were killed for being young, for being passionate, for believing that democracy and justice were worth fighting for. He paused, letting the weight of that reality settle. "I am sharing this tonight not to open old wounds, but because healing requires truth. We cannot build the Burkina Faso we want, free, just, sovereign, if we continue to hide from our own history. The people responsible for these crimes must be identified and held accountable, regardless of their current status or influence. and the families who have suffered for 3 decades deserve recognition, compensation, and the dignity of official acknowledgement that their loved ones were murdered by their own government. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more content. The response to his address was overwhelming and divided. Many Burkinabés, especially younger generations, praised his courage in confronting difficult history. Families of the murdered students came forward with their own stories, adding detail to the picture of systematic repression that had characterized the Traoré era. But there was also backlash. Former government officials, some still influential in business and society, condemned the address as unnecessarily divisive. They argued that reopening old cases would destabilize the country, that it was better to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. Ibrahim knew this resistance would come. Truth was always uncomfortable for those who had benefited from lies. Chapter 7. The Other Families. In the weeks following his address, Ibrahim met privately with the families of the other 12 students who had been murdered alongside his sister. He gathered them in a conference room at the presidential residence. 12 families who had shared his mother's pain of not knowing, of being forced to imagine endless possibilities because the truth had been hidden. An older woman named Fatima Sawadogo stood to speak, her voice carrying the weight of decades of grief. My son, Boukari, was 21. He was studying engineering, wanted to build roads and bridges to connect our country. When he didn't come home, police told us he had probably joined a radical group and left the country. They made us feel ashamed, like we had raised a son who would abandon his family. For 29 years, I lived with that shame, wondering what we had done wrong. Now I learn he was murdered for believing in justice, for standing with his friends. That's not shame, that's honor. Others shared similar stories. Children who had been brilliant students, passionate advocates, young people full of potential who had been erased from existence because they dared to speak up. Every family had been fed the same lies, threatened into silence, forced to grieve alone without answers. I'm establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Ibrahim announced. It will investigate not just what happened to our 13 children, but all political disappearances and murders during the Traoré era. Every family deserves to know the truth. Every victim deserves to be remembered. And those responsible will face justice, whether through courts or through public accounting of their crimes. He also announced practical measures. A memorial would be built on the site of the old detention facility, naming all 13 students and any others whose stories emerged through investigation. A scholarship fund would be established in their names, supporting students who demonstrated commitment to social justice and reform. And December 1st, the date of their execution, would be designated a national day of remembrance for all victims of political violence. His mother attended this meeting, sitting among the other families who shared her pain. Afterward, she approached him with tears in her eyes. For 29 years, I felt so alone in my grief. Now I know I wasn't alone. 12 other families suffered the same loss, asked the same questions, were fed the same lies. There's something powerful in that shared truth, even though the truth is terrible. Chapter 8. The investigation deepens. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by respected human rights lawyer Mariam Sankara, no relation to Thomas Sankara, began its work immediately. As they dug deeper into archives and conducted interviews with former security officials, a picture emerged of systematic violence that went far beyond 13 murdered students. The Traoré government had maintained an elaborate apparatus of repression, targeting anyone who challenged its authority. Journalists, activists, union leaders, opposition politicians, many had been arrested, imprisoned without trial, tortured, or killed. The 13 students were just one group among many who had disappeared into this system, but there was resistance to the investigation. Some former officials refused to testify. Documents were mysteriously lost or destroyed. Witnesses reported being intimidated or threatened. It became clear that even 29 years later, even with Traoré long out of power, there were people determined to keep the truth buried. General Gilbert Diendéré, whose signature had authorized the students' execution, was already in prison for his role in a 2015 coup attempt. When commission investigators requested to interview him, he initially refused. It took Ibrahim personally visiting the prison, sitting across from the man who had ordered his sister's death, to finally break through. I was following orders, Traoré said, his voice defiant. The students were a threat to national stability. They were organizing protests, disrupting society. We did what we had to do. Ibrahim looked at him with cold contempt. They were children demanding better education. My sister wanted to be a doctor. Bukari Sawadogo wanted to build bridges. What threat did they pose that justified execution without trial? You don't understand the context. I understand perfectly, Ibrahim interrupted. You murdered 13 people because they dared to believe in something better than a corrupt dictatorship. You took away their futures, their families, everything they could have become. And you did it not because it was necessary, but because it was convenient. Because it was easier to kill them than to listen to them. Traoré looked away, unable to meet Ibrahim's eyes. Whatever justifications he had constructed over the years were crumbling in the face of direct confrontation with the consequences of his actions. The commission will document your crimes, Ibrahim said, standing to leave. Whether you cooperate or not, the truth will come out. The only question is whether you'll show enough humanity to help the families you devastated finally get answers. After several days of consideration, Traoré agreed to provide testimony. His detailed accounting of the systematic repression, including names of other officials involved and locations where victims were buried, broke open the investigation in ways that had seemed impossible. Chapter 9. The Memorial. 9 months after Ibrahim found the photograph that started everything, a memorial was unveiled at the site of the former detention facility. The concrete building had been partially preserved as a historical site, with plaques explaining its role in political repression. But the centerpiece was a new structure, a curved wall of polished black stone bearing the names of victims of political violence, starting with the 13 students murdered in 1995. Aminata Traoré's name was there, along with Bukari Sawadogo and the other 11 students. But as the commission's work continued, more names were being added. Journalists who had disappeared, union organizers whose deaths had been ruled accidents, opposition activists who had simply vanished. The wall was long, and tragically, it was still growing as more cases came to light. The dedication ceremony drew thousands of people, families of victims, human rights activists, students from the university where Aminata had studied, and ordinary Burkinabés who believed that confronting the past was essential to building a better future. Ibrahim spoke at the ceremony, standing beside his mother and the other families who had waited so long for this recognition. This memorial serves 2 purposes, he said. First, it honors those who were taken from us, who believed in justice enough to risk everything. Their names are carved in stone so that they will never be forgotten, so that future generations will know that ordinary people stood against tyranny and paid the ultimate price. He paused, looking at the long wall of names. But this memorial's second purpose is to remind us, all of us, that silence in the face of injustice has consequences. For 29 years, people knew what had happened to these 13 students. Officials who gave the orders, guards who carried them out, bureaucrats who filed the paperwork, journalists who never asked the difficult questions. All of them knew, and all of them remained silent. That silence allowed the crimes to continue, allowed more people to be disappeared, allowed families to suffer without answers. This memorial is our promise that we will never again allow such silence. We will speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable. We will demand accountability even when it's difficult. We will remember even when it's painful. His mother stepped forward to lay flowers at the base of the wall, specifically at her daughter's name. Aminata dreamed of being a doctor, she said quietly. She wanted to heal people, to make Burkina Faso healthier and stronger. She never got to fulfill that dream, but in a way, by fighting for truth and justice, she helped heal our nation's wounds. Her death, and the deaths of all these others, won't be meaningless if we learn from them, if we build a country where such things never happen again. Throughout the day, people came to the memorial, some to remember specific victims, others simply to bear witness to history. Students from Aminata's old university gathered around her name, taking photographs, leaving flowers, discussing her story and what it meant for their own generation's struggle for justice and reform. Chapter 10. The Legal Reckoning. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work eventually led to criminal prosecutions. Traoré, already imprisoned, faced additional charges related to the students' murders. Other former officials were arrested as evidence accumulated against them. The trials were public, broadcast to the nation, forcing Burkina Faso to confront its history in the most direct way possible. Not everyone supported these prosecutions. Critics argued that they were politically motivated, that Ibrahim was using his sister's death to punish his enemies. Some suggested it was better to focus on reconciliation rather than retribution, that prosecuting old men for crimes committed decades ago served no purpose. But Ibrahim remained firm in his conviction that justice was essential. Reconciliation without accountability is just another form of silence, he said in a press conference. We cannot move forward by pretending the past didn't happen or by excusing those who committed atrocities. The families of victims deserve justice. The nation deserves truth. And future generations deserve to know that crimes against humanity have consequences, even if those consequences come late. The trials revealed the full extent of the systematic repression, detention centers where torture was routine, mass graves where victims were buried, elaborate systems for erasing evidence and intimidating witnesses. It was a dark chapter in Burkina Faso's history, and confronting it was painful, but it was necessary. Fatima Sawadogo testified at one trial, describing the 29 years she had spent wondering what happened to her son. "You took my child from me," she said, pointing at the defendant, a former security official who had supervised the detention facility. "You took him, you killed him, and you let me believe for decades that he had abandoned his family. You didn't just murder him, you murdered my peace of mind, my ability to grieve properly, my relationship with a memory you had poisoned with lies. No sentence will give me back those 29 years, but at least now I know the truth. At least now I can grieve for who my son really was, a brave young man who stood for justice, rather than the fiction you forced me to believe." Her testimony, and testimony from other families, was devastating. Several defendants showed genuine remorse, others remained defiant, but all were convicted based on the overwhelming evidence of their participation in crimes against humanity. Chapter 11. A Sister's Legacy. 2 years after finding the photograph, Ibrahim established the Aminata Traoré Foundation for Justice and Education, funded by seized assets from convicted officials and supplemented by government support. The foundation provided scholarships to students studying medicine, law, human rights, and social justice, continuing the work his sister had started. The first class of scholarship recipients was announced at a ceremony at the University of Ouagadougou, held in the same courtyard where his sister had once walked. 26 students, 2 for each year since her death, received full scholarships along with mentorship and support to pursue their dreams of improving Burkina Faso. Ibrahim spoke to them about his sister, using the photograph he had found to introduce them to the young woman whose memory they honored. Aminata believed that education was a tool for liberation, he told them. She believed that knowledge gave people power to demand better, to build better, to be better. She was murdered because those in power feared that liberation, feared educated citizens who could think critically and demand accountability. Your scholarships are funded by the assets of the people who killed her, poetic justice, taking what they stole and using it to do exactly what they tried to prevent. You are her legacy, your success, your commitment to justice, your work to build a better Burkina Faso. That is how we honor her memory. One scholarship recipient, a medical student named Amina Kabore, approached him after the ceremony. "Captain Traoré, I want you to know that your sister's story changed my life. I was planning to leave Burkina Faso after graduation to seek opportunities elsewhere. But learning what she sacrificed to fight for this country's future, it made me realize that leaving would be abandoning everything she died for. I'm staying. I'm going to work in rural clinics, provide healthcare to communities that have been neglected, because that's what she would have done." This was perhaps the greatest tribute to Aminata's legacy, inspiring a new generation to believe that Burkina Faso was worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth dedicating their lives to improving. Ibrahim's mother became a regular speaker at schools and universities, invited to tell Aminata's story and discuss the importance of truth and justice. She had transformed her grief into purpose, ensuring that her daughter's sacrifice would inspire others. "For 29 years, I couldn't talk about Aminata without crying," she told students at one event. "The not knowing, the shame I felt thinking she had abandoned us, it was a weight I carried every day. But now, even though I know the terrible truth about how she died, I can talk about her with pride. She was brave. She was principled. She stood for something bigger than herself. And that legacy, that's something no one can take away. Chapter 12. The Photograph's Place. 3 years after his discovery, Ibrahim stood in the newly opened National Museum of Memory and Justice, a facility dedicated to documenting Burkina Faso's struggle for human rights and democracy. The museum's centerpiece was a gallery dedicated to political prisoners and victims of state violence. And at its heart was the photograph he had found, Aminata in her yellow dress, standing in front of the university, ready to change the world. Around the photograph were displayed her journal entries, the letter she had written from detention, the official documents that told her story. Interactive displays allowed visitors to learn about all 13 students murdered with her, to understand the context of political repression in which they had lived and died, to see how their sacrifice had contributed to eventual change. But the gallery didn't end with death and mourning. It also celebrated legacy, displaying the work of the Aminata Traoré Foundation, showcasing students who had received scholarships, documenting policy changes that had resulted from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Aminata's story had become part of Burkina Faso's larger narrative about confronting injustice and building a better future. Ibrahim often visited the museum, sometimes alone, sometimes with his mother. He would stand before his sister's photograph, seeing in her young face the potential that had been stolen, but also feeling the impact she continued to have decades after her death. Other visitors would approach him during these visits, thanking him for uncovering the truth, sharing their own stories of family members who had disappeared or suffered under authoritarian rule. The museum had become more than just a memorial. It was a space where people could grieve collectively, learn from history, and commit to ensuring such tragedies never happened again. Colonel Diallo, who had helped Ibrahim with the investigation, commented during one visit, "Captain, when you found that photograph, you could have kept it private. You could have mourned your sister quietly without exposing yourself to the political risks of making this public. Why did you choose to do it?" Ibrahim looked at the gallery around them, families learning about loved ones they had lost, students studying the history of repression and resistance, ordinary citizens confronting difficult truths about their nation's past. "Because truth matters more than comfort," he said. "My sister died fighting for a better Burkina Faso. The least I could do was make sure her fight wasn't forgotten, make sure her death had meaning. And by telling her story, by uncovering what happened to all 13 students, we opened the door to broader accountability. We forced our nation to confront its history instead of hiding from it." He turned to face Diallo directly. "Leadership isn't about protecting yourself or avoiding difficult topics. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something. My sister understood that. She risked everything for principle. I couldn't do less." That evening, Ibrahim returned to his mother's house for a quiet family dinner. The photograph he had found, the one that started everything, was now prominently displayed in her living room. Alongside more recent photos of scholarship recipients and newspaper clippings about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, his mother served traditional Burkinabe dishes that Aminata had loved, and they ate while sharing memories, not just the painful ones about her disappearance, but also the happy ones from before, stories of her childhood, her sense of humor, her dreams, her kindness. For the first time in 3 decades, they could remember Aminata completely, without the shadow of unanswered questions darkening every memory. "Do you think she would approve of what you've done?" his mother asked. "The investigations, the prosecutions, the memorial." Ibrahim considered the question carefully. "I think she would approve of the truth being told, of families finally getting answers, of justice being served even if it came late. Whether she would approve of all my specific decisions, I can't know. But I tried to honor what she stood for. Truth, justice, believing that Burkina Faso could be better. I hope that's enough." His mother reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "It's more than enough. You gave her back to me, not her life, but her truth. I can finally grieve for who she really was, finally feel proud of her sacrifice without the shame and confusion that came from not knowing." That's a gift beyond measure. As Ibrahim drove back to the presidential residence that night, he reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple photograph found in a cardboard box. He had uncovered a painful truth, that his sister had been murdered by the state she tried to improve. But in uncovering that truth, He had also discovered her legacy, her courage, her unwavering commitment to justice. And he had learned something fundamental about leadership and governance, that confronting difficult history was essential to building a better future, that silence in the face of injustice perpetuated harm, that truth, no matter how painful, was always better than comfortable lies. The photograph of Aminata in her yellow dress had become an image of resistance and hope, reproduced on posters and murals across Ouagadougou, a reminder to every Burkinabe that ordinary people could stand against tyranny, that the struggle for justice was never futile, even when it cost everything. 3 years earlier, Ibrahim had been sorting through family belongings, expecting nothing more than a trip down memory lane. Instead, he had found a photograph that unlocked decades of hidden truth, that brought closure to 13 families, that exposed systematic crimes, that established new commitments to human rights and accountability. His sister had wanted to change the world. 30 years after her death, through the photograph that survived when she could not, she had done exactly that. The end. Epilogue. 5 years had passed since Ibrahim Traoré discovered the photograph that changed everything. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Ouagadougou as he stood on the balcony of the presidential residence, coffee in hand, watching the city awaken to another day. In the distance, he could see the distinctive silhouette of the National Museum of Memory and Justice, its modern architecture a stark contrast to the colonial-era buildings surrounding it. The museum had become a pilgrimage site, visited by thousands each month: students, families, tourists, anyone who wanted to understand Burkina Faso's difficult journey toward truth and reconciliation. His phone buzzed with the morning briefing from his chief of staff. Among the usual updates on security operations, economic indicators, and diplomatic meetings was a note that made him pause. Anniversary event at Memorial Site tomorrow. 12 families confirmed attendance. Media coverage expected to be extensive. Your mother requests your presence. Tomorrow would mark 5 years since the memorial wall was unveiled, 5 years since the names of Aminata and the other 12 students were carved into black stone, ensuring they would never be forgotten. Half a decade had passed, but the work that photograph had initiated continued to ripple through Burkina Faso society in ways both expected and surprising. Ibrahim finished his coffee and prepared for the day ahead, knowing that before he could focus on current governance challenges, he needed to visit someone who had become an unexpected ally in the ongoing quest for historical justice. General Gilbert Diendéré, now 71 years old, remained imprisoned but had transformed from defiant perpetrator to reluctant witness to, finally, genuine advocate for truth-telling. It was a journey Ibrahim had not anticipated when he first confronted the man who had signed his sister's death warrant. The prison where Diendéré was held had become an unusual hub for the truth and reconciliation process. Several former security officials were housed there, and over the years, many had agreed to participate in extensive interviews, providing details about the systematic repression of the Traoré era that would have otherwise remained hidden. Diendéré's cell had become something like an informal archive, filled with documents, maps and notebooks, where he meticulously recorded everything he could remember about operations, personnel, and the locations of mass graves. Ibrahim's security team had initially opposed these prison visits, worried about the optics of the president regularly meeting with convicted criminals. But Ibrahim had insisted, "If we're serious about truth," he had told them, "we have to be willing to engage with people who have ugly truths to tell. Diendéré has information that dozens of families need. My personal discomfort is irrelevant compared to their need for answers." The guard unlocked the cell door, and Ibrahim entered to find Diendéré at his small desk, writing in one of his notebooks. The general looked up, setting down his pen with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to measure his actions precisely. "Captain Traoré," Diendéré said, using Ibrahim's military rank rather than his presidential title, a habit that had never changed over 5 years of occasional meetings. "I wasn't expecting you today. I wanted to ask you something before tomorrow's anniversary event," Ibrahim said, taking the single chair across from Diendéré's desk. 5 years ago, you were defiant. You insisted you were following orders, that what happened to my sister and the others was necessary for national security. What changed?" Diendéré was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the desk. When he spoke, His voice carried a weariness that went beyond physical imprisonment. At first, I believed my own justifications. I had convinced myself that we were protecting Burkina Faso from chaos, that firm measures were necessary. But then, families started testifying at my trial. I heard a mother describe 29 years of not knowing what happened to her son. I heard a sister explain how her brother's disappearance had destroyed her family, how her father died believing his son had abandoned them, and I realized that every justification I had constructed was just a way to avoid confronting what I had actually done. He paused, looking directly at Ibrahim. Your visits changed me too. You could have simply left me here to rot. Instead, you asked questions. You treated me like a human being even though I had ordered your sister's death. That forced me to confront my own humanity. If the brother of someone I murdered could see me as more than a monster, then I had to reckon with the fact that I had treated my victims as less than human. That's what evil is, really. Not some supernatural force, but ordinary people who convince themselves that other people don't fully matter. Ibrahim absorbed this confession, recognizing the journey it represented. Traoré would never be redeemed in any conventional sense. He had committed crimes too terrible for redemption. But his transformation from defender of atrocities to documenter of truth had provided closure for dozens of families. That had value, even if it couldn't erase the past. The Commission has identified 3 more possible burial sites based on your information, Ibrahim said. Excavation begins next week. If we find remains, that's potentially 15 more families who will finally have answers. I know, Traoré replied quietly. I think about them constantly. The people we buried in unmarked graves, whose families never knew. I can't give them back their lives. I can't undo what was done, but I can at least help their families find them, help them have proper burials, help them know the truth. It's insufficient, but it's all I have to offer. After leaving the prison, Ibrahim drove to the University of Ouagadougou, where he had scheduled a meeting with the current leadership of the National Association of Students of Burkina Faso, the same organization his sister had been part of 3 decades earlier. The student movement had experienced a renaissance in recent years, emboldened by the public acknowledgement of past repression and by a government that, at least theoretically, committed to protecting rather than persecuting peaceful activism. The student leaders met him in a conference room decorated with posters commemorating historical student movements, including a large image of the 13 murdered students from 1995. These young people, most in their early 20s, had grown up in a different Burkina Faso than their predecessors, but they still faced many of the same challenges: inadequate educational funding, limited employment prospects, corruption in institutions, and the ongoing threat of terrorism destabilizing the country. Salimata Ouedraogo, the current president of the Student Association, was 23 years old and studying political science. She had been born in 2002, 7 years after Aminata's murder, but Aminata's story had profoundly shaped her worldview. Captain Traoré, she began, we wanted to meet with you because we're planning a major initiative for next year, a national student congress focused on educational reform and economic opportunity. We want to present policy proposals to the government, not just protest grievances. This was exactly the kind of constructive engagement Ibrahim had hoped to foster. Tell me more about your proposals. For the next 2 hours, the students presented detailed plans covering university funding, vocational training expansion, technology infrastructure, and partnerships with the private sector to create internship and employment opportunities. Their proposals were well-researched, pragmatic, and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both Burkina Faso's limitations and its possibilities. This is impressive work, Ibrahim said when they finished. I want to be honest with you. The government doesn't have unlimited resources, and some of these proposals would require years to fully implement. But I commit to you that we will seriously engage with these ideas, that my ministers will meet with your committee, and that we'll work together on what's actually feasible. That's all we're asking for, Salimata replied. My generation learned from what happened to the 13 students. We learned that passion without strategy can be dangerous, that governments sometimes kill rather than listen. But we also learned that staying silent accomplishes nothing. We're trying to find a third path, organized advocacy that's principled but also pragmatic. Ibrahim recognized in Salimata something of his sister's spirit, the same commitment to improving Burkina Faso, but tempered by historical awareness and strategic thinking. "Your generation has advantages we didn't have," he said. "You grew up with access to information, with ability to organize and communicate in ways that were impossible 30 years ago. Use those advantages wisely. Hold us accountable, push us to do better, but also recognize that change takes time and requires building coalitions." As he left the university, Ibrahim felt cautiously optimistic about this new generation of activists. They were idealistic without being naive, passionate without being reckless. If Burkina Faso's future depended on engaged, thoughtful citizens demanding better governance, then perhaps that future was brighter than it sometimes seemed. That evening, Ibrahim had dinner with his mother at her home. At 74 years old, she remained remarkably active, having found purpose in her advocacy work. She spoke regularly at schools and community centers, telling Aminata's story and discussing the importance of confronting difficult truths. She had also become close friends with several other mothers who had lost children to political violence, forming an informal support network that met weekly to share memories and provide emotional support. "I spoke at a high school today," she told Ibrahim as they ate. "The students asked whether I was angry at Burkina Faso for what happened to Aminata. I told them no. I was angry at specific people who made specific choices to prioritize power over justice, but the country itself, the land and the people, they're worth loving and fighting for. That's what Aminata believed, and that's what you're trying to build." "Do you think we're succeeding?" Ibrahim asked. Sometimes I wonder if all of this, the investigations, the prosecutions, the memorials, if it's actually changing anything fundamental, or if we're just making ourselves feel better about an ugly past." His mother set down her fork and looked at him seriously. "Let me tell you what has changed. 5 years ago, 13 families lived with unanswered questions, with shame that had been unjustly placed on them. Now they know the truth. They can grieve properly. They can feel proud of their children. That's not nothing, Ibrahim, that's everything to those families." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "But beyond those specific families, you've changed how Burkina Faso thinks about its own history. Young people now know that their government once murdered students for demanding justice. They know that silence enabled those crimes. They know that confronting difficult truths is possible and necessary. Those lessons will shape how they engage with power for the rest of their lives. That's profound change, even if it's not immediately visible." The next morning, Ibrahim arrived at the memorial site an hour before the official ceremony was scheduled to begin. The location had been transformed over 5 years from an abandoned detention facility to a thoughtfully designed space for remembrance and education. The original concrete building remained, preserved but clearly labeled with explanatory plaques detailing its history. The memorial wall with its names of victims formed the centerpiece, but surrounding it was a meditation garden, a small museum with rotating exhibits, and an education center where school groups could learn about human rights and political repression. His mother was already there, placing flowers at Aminata's name on the wall. She did this every week, rain or shine, a ritual of remembrance that had become part of her identity. Other families arrived gradually, some Ibrahim recognized from previous commemorations. Others he was meeting for the first time as the commission continued identifying victims and locating their relatives. Fatima Sawadogo, mother of Bukari, approached with her grandchildren. Now in her late 70s, she moved slowly but with determination, leaning on her grandson's arm. "Captain Traoré," she said warmly, "my family wanted to thank you again. Next month, we're finally burying Bukari's remains. Your commission found the mass grave, identified his bones through DNA testing. After 30 years, we can lay him to rest properly. We can visit his grave. We can say goodbye." This was the work that mattered most, not the grand political gestures, but the specific individual impact on families who had suffered. "I'm honored to be invited to the burial," Ibrahim said. "Bukari deserves that dignity, and your family deserves that closure." As more people gathered for the ceremony, Ibrahim noticed a delegation of international visitors, representatives from truth and reconciliation commissions in other African nations, human rights organizations, and academic researchers studying transitional justice. Burkina Faso's process had attracted global attention, both as a model of confronting difficult history and as a cautionary tale about the costs of repression. Dr. Mariam Sankara, who led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, joined Ibrahim near the memorial wall. At 58, she had dedicated her career to human rights law, and the past 5 years had been simultaneously the most challenging and most meaningful of her professional life. Captain, I wanted to update you on our progress before the ceremony begins. We've now documented 473 cases of political disappearance or murder during the Traoré era. That's 473 families who have received some form of answer, some acknowledgement of what happened to their loved ones. 473, Ibrahim repeated, the number heavy with implications. That's nearly 500 families who suffered, 500 instances where the state failed its most basic responsibility to protect citizens. Yes, Mariam agreed. But it's also nearly 500 families who now have truth where they previously had only uncertainty. We can't give them back their loved ones, but we can at least give them knowledge and acknowledgement. That has value. The ceremony began with a traditional Burkinabe musical performance, songs of mourning and resilience played on traditional instruments. Then Mariam took the podium to present the Commission's annual report, detailing new cases investigated, remains identified, and perpetrators held accountable. The work was ongoing. They estimated it would take another 3 to 5 years to fully document the extent of political repression during the Traoré era. When it was Ibrahim's turn to speak, he stood before the memorial wall looking at the names. So many names, each representing a life cut short, a family devastated, a future stolen. 5 years ago, he began, we unveiled this memorial with 13 names, students murdered for believing in a better Burkina Faso. Today, this wall bears 473 names, and it will grow longer still as our investigation continues. Each name represents not just a death, but a story of courage, a family's grief, and our nation's failure to protect its own people. He paused, letting the weight of that reality settle over the assembled crowd. Some have asked why we continue this work, why we insist on digging up painful history when we could simply move forward. I understand that impulse. It would be easier to forget, to focus on the present and future without confronting the past. But I think of my sister Aminata, whose photograph started this journey. I think of her letter written in detention, her plea that the truth be told. I think of Fatima Sawadogo, who spent 30 years wondering what happened to her son Bukari. I think of every family represented on this wall, and I know that easier is not better. Truth is hard, but it's necessary. He gestured to the memorial wall behind him. This is not just a monument to the dead. It's a commitment to the living. It's our promise that we will never again allow such crimes to happen in silence. It's our declaration that every life matters, that every citizen deserves protection and justice, that no government has the right to murder its own people and hide the evidence. The ceremony continued with testimonies from families, poetry readings by students, and a moment of silence for all victims of political violence. As the formal program concluded, and people dispersed through the memorial site, small conversations bloomed everywhere. Families sharing memories, students asking questions of elders, teachers explaining history to children. The site had become not just a place of mourning, but a space for education and community building. Ibrahim found himself in conversation with a group of international visitors researching transitional justice. Captain Traoré, one researcher asked, your approach has been unusually comprehensive, combining truth commission, criminal prosecutions, memorialization, and victim compensation. Most countries choose one or two of these approaches. Why did you insist on all of them? Because each serves a different need, Ibrahim explained. The Truth Commission provides historical documentation and helps families understand what happened. Criminal prosecutions establish accountability and demonstrate that even powerful people face consequences for atrocities. Memorialization ensures we don't forget and provides space for public mourning. And victim compensation acknowledges that the state failed these families and has an obligation to provide material support, not just symbolic gestures. But hasn't the comprehensiveness created political problems? Another researcher asked. We've heard that some former officials and their supporters have criticized your approach as vindictive. Of course they have, Ibrahim replied. People who benefited from the old system, who were complicit in crimes or simply preferred not to confront uncomfortable truths, they would prefer we moved on without accountability. But their comfort is less important than justice for victims. I've learned that doing the right thing often means accepting that some people will be unhappy with you. Later that afternoon, Ibrahim visited the Aminata Traoré Foundation offices located in a renovated colonial building near the university. The foundation had grown significantly beyond its initial focus on scholarships, now operating programs in civic education, human rights training, and support for families of political violence victims. The staff of 23 included several scholarship recipients who had completed their degrees and returned to work for the organization. Amina Kabore, the medical student who had approached him at the first scholarship ceremony, was now Dr. Kabore, working as a primary care physician in a rural clinic, while also serving on the foundation's board. She greeted Ibrahim with a warm smile and tour of the foundation's new civic education center, where high school students from across Burkina Faso participated in week-long programs learning about democracy, human rights, and effective advocacy. We've trained over 3,000 students in the past 3 years, Amina explained. The goal is to create a generation that understands both their rights and their responsibilities as citizens. We teach them about Aminata and the 13 students, but also about how to organize effectively, how to engage with government constructively, how to demand accountability without resorting to violence. They walked through classrooms where students were engaged in mock negotiations with government officials, learning the skills of policy advocacy. In another room, a group practiced public speaking, preparing presentations on issues affecting their communities. The energy was palpable, young people discovering their voices and learning how to use them effectively. Your sister would be proud of this, Amina said. Not just the scholarship program bearing her name, but the broader work of empowering young people to participate in democracy. That's what she was fighting for. Not just abstract justice, but the practical ability of ordinary citizens to shape their government. Ibrahim spent an hour meeting with scholarship recipients, hearing about their studies and their plans for the future. A young man studying agricultural engineering explained his research on drought-resistant crops that could help Sahel communities adapt to climate change. A law student described her internship with a human rights organization documenting police abuses. An aspiring teacher talked about developing curricula that incorporated Burkina Faso's complex history, including difficult periods like the Traoré era. These conversations reminded Ibrahim of why the work mattered. His sister's murder and the murders of 12 others had been terrible crimes. But by refusing to let those crimes be forgotten, by insisting on truth and accountability, they had created ripple effects that continued to shape Burkina Faso's future in positive ways. That evening, Ibrahim attended a community gathering in one of Ouagadougou's popular quarters, where residents had organized a discussion forum on governance and accountability. These forums had emerged organically over the past few years, spaces where ordinary citizens could discuss political issues, voice concerns, and develop collective positions on policies affecting their lives. It was exactly the kind of civic engagement Ibrahim wanted to encourage, not blind support for government, but informed participation in democracy. The discussion that evening focused on education funding, with parents, teachers, and students all contributing perspectives on what was needed and what was realistic given budget constraints. Ibrahim listened more than he spoke, taking notes on concerns and suggestions. When he did contribute, it was to explain budget realities and policy constraints, not to defend government decisions, but to provide context for difficult choices. An elderly woman named Salamata stood to speak, her voice carrying authority earned through decades of community leadership. Captain Traoré, I want to thank you for what you've done with the Truth Commission and the memorial. My nephew disappeared in 1998. He was a labor organizer who challenged corruption in the mining sector. For 26 years, we didn't know what happened to him. Last year, the commission found his name in detention records and located his grave. We buried him properly last month. She paused, emotion making her voice shake slightly. But I want to ask you something difficult. You've done good work uncovering the past, but what about the present? We still have corruption. We still have officials who abuse power. We still have people who suffer because the government doesn't protect them. How do we make sure that 50 years from now, someone doesn't have to dig up our generation's crimes the way you've dug up the Traoré era's crimes? It was a fair and challenging question, the kind of question that made clear that truth and reconciliation about the past was necessary but insufficient. The real test was whether confronting history actually changed how power operated in the present. You're absolutely right, Ibrahim acknowledged. Documenting past crimes doesn't automatically prevent future crimes. That requires building institutions, independent courts, free media, strong civil society, transparent government processes. It requires citizens like all of you staying engaged, demanding accountability, refusing to accept that corruption and abuse are inevitable, and it requires leaders who understand that their job is to serve people, not rule over them. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I can't promise that Burkina Faso will never have problems with corruption or abuse of power. Every country struggles with these issues. But I can promise that unlike the Traoré era, we won't try to hide problems or silence people who speak up about them. We'll be transparent about our failures as well as our successes. We'll be held accountable. And we'll support citizens and institutions that demand accountability from us. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, ranging across topics from healthcare access to infrastructure development to security concerns about ongoing jihadist threats. It was exhausting but also invigorating. This was what governance should look like: constant engagement with citizens, wrestling with difficult questions, admitting uncertainty while committing to do better.